Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Jackson, and today I'll be talking about Wallbleed. This is joint work between both GFW Report, the University of Colorado Boulder, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as well as the Shinomi Lab. Not sure. Oh, there it goes. Great. So to get started, we'll go over a little bit of background on DNS and then a common censorship technique known as DNS injection. So to start, if a client wants to access a website like Facebook, the first thing they need to do is get the IP address associated with that website. And to do that, they're going to make a query to a resolver asking, hey, where can I find Facebook? The resolver will then respond with the IP address associated with that domain, and the client can go on to connect to that host directly. However, a very common censorship technique that we see is there will be a censor sitting on that path, and it will observe all of those queries from the client to the resolver. And when the censor sees a domain it doesn't agree with, like Facebook, it will inject its own response with an IP address unrelated to Facebook completely. So when the client goes and connects to that IP address looking for Facebook, it'll be unsuccessful. Now eventually, the resolver's response will make it to the client. But because the censor is located closer on the path to the client than the resolver is, most of the time its injected packet will get there first, and the client will discard the one that came from the actual resolver. This is a very common censorship technique that we see in China, and it's part of what we consider the Great Firewall, or the GFW. Now, our talk is primarily about how we found a memory disclosure bug in the GFW's injector. So let's go over a little bit of background on memory disclosure vulnerabilities. And to do that, we'll go through a slightly modified XKCD cartoon on the Heartbleed bug. So the important thing to understand here is that we have a server that takes in client-provided data. And not only does it take in that client-provided data, but it trusts the client to provide a length with that data as well. It's also important to understand that the server response includes that client-provided data, which of course leads us questioning what exactly would happen if we provide a relatively small amount of data, like hat, but we tell the server that we actually sent them 500 letters. Well, in the case where the server does not validate the length of the data provided, we find that the server will respond with a memory disclosure. Effectively, we'll see the 3 letters hat, followed by an additional 497 letters out of memory. And this is what a memory disclosure vulnerability is. So let's dig into how that can occur in a DNS injector. So what we did is we were sending what we have now is a standard DNS query, but we're zoomed in on a specific part known as the queue name. This is where that domain name is structured into the query. And it follows this structure where we have the length of the label, so 08, followed by that many bytes of label, so Facebook, and then another length 03 followed by the label com, and then we have a null terminator ending that the label or the queue name section of the query has come to an end. The response we get, the injected response we get, that is, when sending this packet across the Great Firewall looks like this, and it's a very standard DNS response. We have that query kind of encoded at the top there, and then what's highlighted in blue is an IP address. However, what we find in the DNS injector is that this IP address is a wrong answer, and in this case, it's an IP associated with Dropbox, right? No relationship to Facebook. So this led us to question what exactly would happen if we took this exact same DNS query, but just changed that very last length field from 03 to FF and sent that across the GFW. Well, we see a very similar response with the minor exception that there's a little over 100 bytes of leaked memory included in the answer. And in this particular case, we are looking at UPnP network traffic, but we'll kind of dig into that in just a second. So that leads us into what is being leaked, right? What were all those bytes that we were seeing? And to really understand exactly what could be leaked from this, from the DNS injector, we sent millions of these Wallbleed queries, and we collected hundreds of gigabytes worth of leaked memory. And then we used regular expressions to classify this traffic and really understand exactly what we were seeing. One of the main things we were seeing was, in fact, network traffic, right? That UPnP protocol is a perfect example. And what's particularly interesting about that is that UPnP is a protocol that's on top of HTTP, so it's port 80, and it's also a TCP protocol, right? With DNS, you expect that on port 53 and UDP. So this indicates to us that there's no pre-filtering of the traffic that this injector is seeing. They're seeing all of the network traffic that goes across their like tap or interface, and it's not just stuff related to DNS. We also saw a number of HTTP date headers, and this was particularly useful for understanding exactly how long traffic sat on the box. So we found that they had about enough cache for traffic to be there for 1 second or so. After that, we saw very little traffic that had lasted beyond that amount of time. We were also able to identify Linux stack frames and use that to infer that this was an x86 architecture. We saw a number of IP headers as well. These were particularly interesting because it was often a private source IP connecting to a public destination IP, indicating that we weren't just seeing this network traffic they were observing, but we were also seeing network traffic of internal communications between these injectors. And lastly, we found a number of HTTP cookies, password fields, and other things that just go to show how big of a risk this is to user privacy. So I've told you we saw network traffic, and I believe we saw network traffic, but we needed to prove that as well, right? And to do that, we went ahead and set up 2 different hosts that were connecting across the GFW, sending traffic across the GFW. One was just sending a unique sequence. We call this a magic sequence in the paper, and it was identifiable to us if we happened to see it in other traffic. The other host was sending these Wallbleed queries. And what we found is that when we got a Wallbleed response, it would contain that unique sequence, proving to us that we were, in fact, seeing live leaked network traffic and not something else. So one of the key contributions of this paper was that we were able to reverse engineer the C equivalent code of this injector. And that full code can be found in the appendix if you're interested, but this is a brief snippet sort of explaining where we can see a memory overread that ultimately led to the disclosure. So one of the last questions that we wanted to answer was exactly who was affected by Wallbleed. Was it just people in China, people connecting through China, what have you? And to do this, we sent Wallbleed requests from a client located in the US to the entire IPv4 space. And the red dots that you see are hosts around the world that still triggered an injection, even though there's no relation to China. This goes to show that not just users in China are affected, but users around the world could have their data leaked as a result of this vulnerability. So now for the last thing that we wanted to study in this is the patching behavior. When you have a typical vulnerability disclosure or a typical vulnerability that you find, the vendor is typically somebody who will tell you what happened, right? We weren't sure that we could expect this when finding a vulnerability in a system like the DNS injection. And so we set up an experiment that would allow us to monitor ourselves. To do that, we selected 1 IP per /24 in China and sent Wallbleed queries every 15 minutes to these IPs. We then observed changes in the responding IP addresses, allowing us to get an idea of how the patch was rolled out. We found that they initially tested a patch due to that drop from the total monitored, and then it returned back to that same baseline. We then see that the patch is rolled out in about 5 stages, and further analysis of the IP addresses that were in each of those stages indicated that this was based on region. So for a quick timeline of exactly what happened here, we discovered Wallbleed in October of 2021. For over 2 years, we've ran the experiments I've just discussed until we found that that Wallbleed was patched in November of 2023. However, it turns out that just a few months later, with some slight modifications to the initial query, we were able to discover Wallbleed v2 and start leaking data again. In April of 2024, Wallbleed v2 is patched, and to date, we haven't found any more vulnerabilities. Now, this talk would be remiss without talking about the ethics of exactly what we did here. And there was a lot of discussion that went into this from the time we started this work until about 5 minutes ago. And so we have a couple of questions that we just want to discuss that sort of guided us through this work, among others. The first being, can we exploit a system that is a source of harm? As security researchers, most of you probably know that you can't exploit systems that you don't control. We believe that this is a atypical situation where the system that we are exploiting or were exploiting was causing harm to millions of users every single day. And that by trying to better understand exactly what was going on in that system, we would be able to potentially help those users get around it. Additionally, we believe that any damage we may have caused to the system, potentially causing it to fall over or any other unexpected result, wouldn't actually affect people's connection to the internet due to the architecture of how the injector is positioned. So the next question is, should this type of vulnerability be disclosed? So I want to be perfectly clear, we never got the opportunity to disclose the vulnerability. We were planning on it. You saw that we had set up an experiment to monitor the patching behavior, but shortly after we set that experiment up, the vulnerability got disclosed before we were able to actually notify the proper authorities. However, we did intend on notifying them. And the reason that we found that this vulnerability should be disclosed is because there was no indication that by helping them patch this vulnerability, we were going to help the censor cause further harm. We were simply trying to reduce the harms that they were already causing. And with that, that's my talk. Wallbleed, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? We have a few minutes.
Thank you for your great research. I just being curious that you mentioned that you are doing experiments to prove that your like the injector is seeing live traffic.
Yes.
I wonder how long did that experiment take for you to discover that to discover your own traffic in the leaked information, and are you going to infer any more details of that system? For example, its memory size or something else using that information?
Sure. So just to clarify your question there, you are curious how long it took for us to see the traffic after we sent it?
Yes.
Yes. So it was pretty immediate. It was less than a second. So going back to some of those other things we were able to use to infer how long traffic was cached, we were seeing all of our traffic in less than 1 second when we saw it. Now, it's also important to note that we didn't see a lot of the queries that we sent. We had to send a lot of queries very quickly, as well as, or a lot of magic sequences very quickly, as well as a bunch of Wallbleed queries in order to see just a few of the sequences leaked in memory.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again.